Good evening, viewers, and welcome to Shivery, Chilling Tales of Horror. I'm your script keeper and host, Russell, and tonight I have the pleasure of bringing to you the last batch of spooky stories submitted by patrons all across Washoe County. Tonight is not for the faint of heart. We meet several characters who meet their grim ends. I don't know about you, but I can smell our first story already. We best get to it before it spoils.
The Rotting by Calvin C. It was a cloudy Saturday morning. A small breeze, but not a tree moving. Michael felt strange today. His parents were gone for the weekend visiting family on the East Coast. Michael didn't want to stay home all day, so he texted Carter, his best friend. No reply. Strange. Carter normally always replied quickly. Michael found himself sweating, which was weird because it was never hot in the morning. He decided to watch some TV while he waited for Carter to text him back. So he walked to the living room and grabbed the remote. Sometimes the TV wouldn't turn on the first try, so Michael tried again. And once again, it didn't turn on. Michael tried a third time, a fourth time, and a fifth time, and still nothing from the TV. Michael was frustrated that the TV wouldn't work, and Carter wouldn't reply, so he was in a bad mood. Michael found himself really, really hungry, but he was confused because he normally didn't get hungry in the morning, and didn't like eating breakfast. He opened the fridge looking for food and found some leftover chicken from the night before. He ate that and was still hungry. He made a box of mac and cheese, and he ate that. After that, he was still a little bit hungry, but definitely better. He didn't want to eat more because he didn't have too much food in the refrigerator. And he checked his phone. Still no reply from Carter, and he decided to call him. "Hello?" Carter answered. "Yo, what?" And as soon as Michael started to say anything, Carter hung up. What's wrong with him? Michael thought. He decided to text him one more time, but got no reply. Michael decided to get outside and walk to Carter's house, and once he got there, he rang the doorbell and took a step back. Nobody answered, so he rang the doorbell again and knocked on the door. Still, no one answered. He decided to call him, straight to voicemail. Michael found himself sweating again, even though it wasn't hot outside at all, and this made Michael even more frustrated. He decided to go to Carl's Deli, his favorite sandwich shop. When he got there, it was empty, which was weird because Carl's Deli was normally pretty packed. Michael greeted Mr. Thompson, the owner of the place, as he normally did. "Hey, Mr. Thompson," he said. Hi there," Mr. Thompson replied, in an unsure-sounding voice. "Oh, the usual," Michael said as he picked up a bag of chips. Have you been here before?" asked Mr. Thompson. Michael chuckled. "Good one, Mr. Thompson," he said. "I'm sorry, do I know you?" asked Mr. Thompson. Michael turned around slowly, head before shoulders, and he noticed that he was sweating again. "Yeah, no, I'm sorry. May I have the bacon pastrami special, please?" said Michael. And while Michael waited for his sandwich, he thought to himself, "What is going on? First I get extremely hungry in the morning, then Carter doesn't talk to me, now Mr. Thompson doesn't know me? I think I'm just going to head home after this," Michael thought. "That'll be 7:43, said Mr. Thompson. "Thanks," Michael said. And as he's walking out of Carl's Deli, he notices that his toes have been hurting for a while. He heads home quickly. The closer he gets to his house, the more his toes seem to hurt. Michael, sweating like crazy, gets home and notices his toes are aching in pain. Straight away he takes off his socks and shoes, and is disgusted by his toes. The smell is horrifyingly awful. His toes are a navy greenish color. It is rotting, almost looks like moldy guacamole, and he looks at his fingers, which are also turning an awful color. Michael starts to panic. He calls Carter once again, no answer. He calls both of his parents, no answer. He calls 911, no answer. Michael started to panic even more as he noticed the rotting is spreading through his body quickly. It hurts really bad. "Ah!" Screams of horror from Michael take over. Michael takes his shirt off, only to find that it's all over his belly and chest too. The rotting is slowly going up his shoulders, his neck, chin. "Time for school," he hears a voice. It's his mom's voice. Michael opens his eyes, laying in bed. It was all a dream.
Ooh, what a nightmare. I can relate. Suffering a little rot myself. If you're not currently rotting, consider yourself lucky. At least more lucky than the 13. The 13, you might be asking? Well, I'll let Rowan B explain that in this next story.
Unlucky 13 by Rowan B. It was a beautiful day, August 13th, 2013. The grass was as green as if it were the first day of spring, and the sky was a brilliant forget-me-not blue with a few dreamy white clouds. Delicate flowers swayed in the warm breeze outside every identical house on 13th Circle. This is where they lived, Jade, Gretchen, and Francis. They were laughing, all of them, even Jade, who seemed almost always grumpy, and they were standing in the middle of their almost always empty street and soaking up the golden rays of sunlight. Gretchen had just told a funny version of the ancient myth about how a killer monster named the Boogie Monster lived in their town. Their laughter was the first thing in days that actually cheered them up. Last week, one of the old ladies on their street had died from a heart attack. That's what they were told, at least. That was all they had been thinking about for the past 5 days. The warm air, full of carefree laughter, suddenly turned deadly silent. They had all heard a rustle in one of the hedges lining each perfect house, and they slowly turned around. There it was. There was no mistaking it. It had a black coat, piercing red eyes, razor-sharp claws, and a mouth full of fangs dripping in yellow slobber that could have easily bitten the head off an old lady. It was the Boogie Monster, and they ran for their lives, and the Boogie Monster immediately began to chase them down. They tore through the break in the hedges and onto the stone path leading to the front door of Francis's house. Jade wildly grasped the black door handle, not paying attention at all to the address, and she flung the door open and madly ran into the house. Once everyone was inside, Jade slammed the door with a bang and fumbled with the lock, her hands shaking uncontrollably. The three of them leaned against the door and slid to the bottom, and Gretchen closed her eyes to keep herself from screaming and pushed all the wild thoughts into the very back of her mind. Jade was shaking and sweating like no one else. Although her parents had tried to convince her it was fake, her biggest fear was the Boogie Monster. Frances was frozen with fear, and the only thing functioning was her heart, beating so fast it seemed it would burst through her chest, and her breath coming out shaky, heaving in gulps of air. They sat in silence, all very grateful for escaping the horrible beast. 20 minutes later, that's when it happened. Or more like, didn't happen. Nothing. No one came running when the door slammed. No one welcomed Frances and her friends when they entered the house they thought was hers. "We're in the wrong house," Gretchen exclaimed, and the edge of her panic in her hoarse voice, and the three of them stood up, and Gretchen squinted through the peephole in the door. With no Boogie Monster in sight, Gretchen tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. And they tried 4 more times before finally giving up. Sweating, they turned around and observed the strange house they were trapped inside. All of them realized that something wasn't right. Frances screamed. "We're in house number 13, she moaned. This was Mrs. Beltroy's house. The house that had belonged to the kind old woman that had just passed away." And Gretchen stumbled backwards in shock. Her white face all of a sudden disappeared. Frances and Jade ran after where Gretchen had been and disappeared as well. Black, cold air rushed past their ears, and Gretchen, followed closely by Frances and Jade, had just fallen down through a big hole in the middle of the hardwood floor, and they all landed with a muffled thud, roughly on top of each other. Shivering, they managed to pull themselves back up to their feet. The dark, damp room they had fallen into was circular, looking like an old basement or roomy underground bunker. Jade took a step forward, making the worst decision of her life. The ceiling had been covered in bats, and as Jade made her move, they swooped down on her like raptors diving for a field mouse 50 feet below. Jade screamed as the swarm of terrifying bats clouded around her with their horrible smell and unforgettably ugly, pointed faces. And they stayed there for around 3 seconds before crumbling into ashes before their eyes. Jade was physically fine but petrified. She stood there for a few minutes, her eyes closed, Frances and Gretchen too afraid to move, and Jade eventually collapsed onto the floor and the other two ran to her aid. She was in shock, horrified. But finally, after lots of cooing and encouragement, Jade got off the ground and they began to examine the room with caution, searching for any type of clue on how to escape, and trying not to fall into any more booby traps. An hour into their hopeless search, a faint whisper in Miss Beltroy's raspy voice moaned, "Each tap the floor 15 times with your left foot before clapping twice, then scream at the top of your lungs, ah!" The shaky voice ended with a scream. Their only hope was to repeat what Miss Beltroy had instructed. The ground shook slightly, 15 times. The sharp punctuations of hands smacking together pierced the silent room twice before 3 blood-curdling shrieks echoed through the cellar. A full minute of silence passed while everyone held their bated breath, before a trap door appeared on the floor in the center of the room. With no other hopes of escaping, they pulled open the heavy trap door and climbed down the ladder underneath the trap door until they reached a cobblestone pathway, leading to yet another ladder, and Frances went first in scaling the second, never-ending ladder. Bang! Frances's head hit a round metal plate That is finally where the ladder ended, although Frances barely held on as her head began to spin. After a moment of recovery, Frances pushed open the metal plate, only now realizing it was an empty plate to the sewers on the surface of 13th Street, although that thing did not lead anywhere near the sewers. Once the three relieved girls were all standing in the sunlight, Jade pushed the plate back into place, and Frances began to run home, and Jade and Gretchen did the same, completely forgetting about the earlier events. Frances screamed, almost dying of fright as the boogeyman dragged her off into the woods, never to be seen again. And the earth froze. Jade and Gretchen didn't realize they had stopped breathing until their throats tightened and they burst into tears. They realized their position and ran into their own homes. As the mysterious and sad days dragged along, the beautiful weather taunted them with its happiness. Jade and Gretchen missed their best friend, although they were very glad to have each other. It seemed as though nothing could get worse, but about 2 weeks after seeing Frances for the last time, her ghostly white face contorted in fear, school started. Jade came home one day and complained to her mother that she couldn't think right. This happened 4 more times before Jade found herself in the hospital, very sick. Her parents and Gretchen glued to the side of her bed, staring with blotchy faces at her pale one. Hoping that Jade would stay with her, Gretchen spent all of her time by her side, trying to make her laugh or even show a hint of a smile, and trying to keep Jade from giving up on life. 3 days later, Jade shut her eyes for the last time. The rabies disease she had gotten from the bats she encountered in Miss Beltroy's house, causing her body to give way to death, leaving Gretchen all alone. Gretchen ran, out of the hospital, and down the street, out of the hospital, down the street, and onto 13th Circle. And when Jade's parents ran after her, they found a splash of blood and a few black hairs on the sidewalk. At the end of the month, the death toll for the small town they lived in, Misfortuneville, was 13 deaths, the population only being 1,300 people. Those 13 people were never seen again.
I'm sure dogs were used to search for those missing. It's one of the great things about dogs, wouldn't you say? Their ability to find things. Well, I hope you find this next story that includes a dog to be as horrifyingly weird as I did.
The Despised Dog by Katie J. Monty was a very, very blind guy. He also lacked a lot of common sense. Yet he didn't know that he himself was blind. He thought everyone was like that. His sister, Molly, helped him around and took care of every one of his millions of needs. She despised him, yet he didn't know that either. The only reason why Molly took care of him was because she got paid. A lot. "Monty, just go look in the fridge and find your own food," she said, and had forgotten that he was blind with no way of looking in the fridge. "Okay," he replied, and he quickly felt his way to the fridge, and while he was walking there, Molly sighed and sat back on the couch. It hadn't occurred to her until she heard, "Uh-oh," from the fridge. "Oh my God," she said to herself, and she quickly got up to see Monty standing in the fridge, a pickle jar in his hand, while the contents of the fridge were spilling on him. "Back up!" she yelled at him. "Huh?" She quickly moved out to push him from the falling food. In spite of her annoyance, she couldn't bear a day without food. "Do you want anything from the grocery store?" she annoyingly said to Monty, and he replied with a simple no, despite the aggravation in her voice. At the store, Molly picked out many things, and as she was picking up more eggs, she had an idea. She decided that instead of taking care of Monty herself, a service dog would. Yet, she would be the one who got the credit. An evil grin slowly emerged from her mouth. While picking up the new dog, it was hyper. It moved like waves in the ocean. While the wind hit them, it squirmed, it barked, and worst of all, it bit Molly on her leg, face, and arm, all while she was trying to drive back to their home. "Will you stop?" she asked the dog. "We will get you home, give you to Monty, and you will take my job as Monty's assistant." "Great," she whispered under her breath to herself. "Another thing to add to my despised list, right after Monty." He whined and whined and whined. Molly and the dog had a very eventful ride on their way home. She had a temptation to just give it back to the shelter, but by now it was getting dark and she could see tiny raindrops hitting her car window. "You know what?" He whined and squirmed and tried to climb up on Molly's chest. She tried pushing his heavy body over. He wouldn't budge. She tried until all of her strength was on him. "I am only doing this because I am tired taking care of Monty, so you will do it while I get the money you're supposed to be getting for taking care of Monty." Suddenly, her arm released and the dog went flying and he broke into porcelain pieces on the floor.
What a creepy and strange end to that poor puppy, Sometimes the scariest things are those we don't quite understand. Our imaginations get the better of us, and this next tale is a prime example of that.
A Deadly Scare by James A. On a dark and stormy night in the town of Hollowville, there were a lot of people filling the neighborhood streets looking for candy on a very special night, Halloween. All the people were wearing cute, cool, and very scary costumes hunting for their candy, and almost all the houses are filled with Halloween decorations. However, there was one house up on the southern hill that had not had any decorations since the Hollow family perished, leaving their old big mansion behind. Among all the people filling the streets, there stood a group of friends, Jack, Curtis, and Liam. And tonight, just like everyone else, they were grabbing all the candy they could. However, a normal Halloween night was not enough for these three kids to enjoy. They needed something more fun and scary than trick-or-treating. It started to get late, and the three of them decided to go see the most haunted mansion there ever was in the town of Hollowville, the old Hollow Mansion. As the kids walked to the front big door of the massive abandoned house, they could hear nothing but creaking from inside the house, losing its balance, and the wind mysteriously blowing. Suddenly, Curtis tripped on a very sharp and small wire on one of the steps up to the house, cutting his leg. The wire cut right into his skin, quickly letting big red drops of blood splash onto the wooden step. He screamed extremely loud that even the next town over reported a child screaming for help. And right before Jack and Liam were about to pick him up, the front door of the house suddenly opened. However, Liam and Curtis could not see anything through the door but pitch-black darkness, and a very strange laughing noise came from inside the very spooky house. Then came a loud thumping noise, along with a giant white sack coming out from the door. After the sack landed right between Liam and Curtis's feet, the door slammed and the night fell silent again. Without thinking, Curtis stood back up with a cut on his leg. It stopped bleeding, but he was still crying in pain, and the three of them picked up the big white sack carefully and realized inside was a whole year's worth of candy. After that, they left with the candy sack, never coming to return again, and no sooner than later they were back in town. Then, the next day, they all came to the park with the candy sack, thinking their troubles were all over, and never daring to return to that deadly house again. And they all sat down on the nice wooden bench in the park, and for hours they talked about how crazy last night was. And after a long conversation, the kids decided to reward themselves with some candy from the candy sack that they had discovered from the mansion last night. As they reached their hands in for the candy, they pulled out what looked like a dead baby with blood on its face. The kids screamed and dropped the dead baby on the floor, and suddenly the bloody face fell off the baby, and the kids realized it was a mask. Along with it, the head came rolling off. The kids finally realized that it was a trick. It was only a head of cabbage.
Any excuse to avoid eating your vegetables, I got you. I hate Brussels sprouts myself, but how you prepare them makes all the difference. Cutting them up into small pieces makes them tolerable. Speaking of cutting, it's scary what knives can do, as this next story will tell you.
The Blood Red Knife by Lucy S. Jane and her best friend Isabel sat down at the oak wood table right next to each other, with the rest of Jane's family and a couple of close friends. Everyone was in high spirits and ready to celebrate her uncle's 43rd birthday. Everyone was clearing and washing the dishes. They were laughing about the celebration that had happened that day. They walked back in the dining room to have chocolate cake and vanilla ice cream for dessert. Her brother, who was the closest to the door, froze in mid-step, paralyzed by what he was seeing. Jane pushed past him into the dining room, where she saw what her brother had seen. It was her grandfather, who was face down on the table, with a deep wound in his back. Fear, fury, and so much noise filled her head, then it stopped abruptly. And as soon as it stopped, she realized it was coming out of her own mouth. Isabel, Jane, and her brother were taken from the scene of the crime and brought to their rooms. No one said anything, but they were all wondering who could have done this. Jane tossed and turned all night until finally she couldn't take it anymore. She replayed in her mind what she had remembered from that night, trying to figure out who killed her grandfather. She especially wanted to know why. And Jane walked into the living room and stared in shock at her brother lying on the floor with a deep cut in his back. She took a step back and tripped, falling to the ground, fear filling her head. She was terrified when she thought about who could have done this terrible thing. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw a figure dressed in all black, slip out of the room with a shining knife clenched in her hand. Jane screamed so loudly that it echoed off the walls and reverberated back to her. Family members that she knew and did not know rushed into the room. They all had shocked faces, staring like her at the dead body on the dusty wooden floor. Everyone rushed in, dressed in black, to mourn her grandfather's death, which had happened only the day before. And when she saw all those people dressed in black, she screamed again, realizing that anyone wearing black could have been the murderer with a blood-red knife. Still traumatized by her experience, she stumbled into a chair at the far end of the porch. She was sitting in relief, knowing that for right now she was okay, or as okay as she could be. So many thoughts were spinning around in her head, so she picked up a book and started reading. She read for a couple of minutes, then slammed the book down abruptly, remembering that the book was a murder mystery, and that reminded her too much of what had just happened to her only brother. Jane walked in the kitchen to find another book that she had left there the day before. The book slammed shut with a bang, and the lights flickered on, and she caught a glimpse of the whole room covered in blood, the color of rust. Then somebody dropped down from the ceiling with a glistening knife in her hand. There were drops of blood covering it. It was the same knife that she saw with the figure who stabbed her brother. As they jumped down from the ceiling, Jane got a clear view of her face. She knew that face with those dark brown eyes. It was the face of her best friend, Isabel Dashwood. The last thing she saw was a flashing knife going in an arc towards her. And the last thought she had was, "She wouldn't do that to me." And then the room suddenly went black, and Jane was dead on the floor, with a knife right by her side. People called her name, running to the kitchen, glancing quickly around at the closed windows with the curtains pulled tightly around them. They stopped short when they saw Jane crumpled on the floor with a streak of sunlight hitting her face. She had a bloody knife next to her hand. The knife had a curved blade made of steel, with blood still dripping down it onto the polished wooden floor, and the handle was the most remarkable part of the knife. It was made out of ebony, with a basilisk carved into it. Isabel picked up the knife, and it might have been her imagination, but she thought the basilisk had just hissed at her.
A cutting story, to be sure. Shall we cut straight to our final tale?
A Night at My Uncle's House by HAYDEN P. It was a dark and stormy night, and I was just chilling in the house. It was 7 p.m., and my parents were making dinner. "Hey, Mom, when's dinner going to be ready?" I asked. 10 minutes, she responded. "Okay," I said. And a couple of minutes later, dinner was ready, and I was starving. My stomach was growling so hard, it felt like it was talking to me. "Finally, dinner's ready," I shouted. "I'm so hungry," I said in my head. My mom told me to set the table, so I did. When we were sat down to eat dinner, my parents looked like they were going to tell me something, but I didn't bother because of how hungry I was. Later that night, my parents wanted to talk to me about something. I was confused. What could they want to tell me? Then I had a thought, but I ignored it. My mom opened her mouth and started to talk. She said, "Your father and I have been talking, and we realized that you have not met your uncle yet, so we bought you an airplane ticket to Colorado to go see him." "Oh no, my worst nightmare has come to life," I said in my head. "Every time my family says the word uncle, I get the heebie-jeebies. The word has haunted my dreams since I was 3 years old. My mom spoke of him once, but never again. When she told me about him, I learned a lot, and that one thing was that I should never go visit him. Ever. Even though I've never seen him, I still get nightmares." And a couple hours later, my mom told me to go to bed. She said, "I have a big day tomorrow because I have to fly to Colorado where my uncle lives." At midnight, I woke up in horror because I couldn't stop having horrible nightmares about my uncle. The rest of the night, I slept well. The next day, I woke up out of deep sleep so hard I banged my head and got a big fat bruise on my forehead. I went downstairs to go eat breakfast, and I made my breakfast and I ate it. But right as I was cleaning my dish, my mom walked out into the room and said, "What happened to you?" I responded and said, "Oh, nothing." And after breakfast, I packed my bag, and my mom took me to the airport. When we got to the airport, we checked in and went through security and checked into my flight. And when we got to my plane, I boarded it. Then I realized this was going to be way worse because my parents weren't going with me. I was flying alone. Later that day, my plane finally landed, and I boarded off. I got luggage and went outside. I ordered a taxi and waited for it to pick me up. A few moments later, I was picked up, and we headed for my uncle's house. When we arrived, I thanked my driver and headed for my uncle's door. I stretched out my arm and rang the doorbell. A second later, the door opened. There he was, the person that freaked me out since I was a kid. He was a tall man, standing at the door. He said, "Come here. I would like a hug from my nephew." And I took a step forward and hugged him. In my head, I said, "He isn't so bad. He's actually really nice." But then he reached for his pocket. My mind was racing. I was wondering what he was going to pull out. I was starting to sweat because of how scared I was. And he put his hand in his pocket and he pulled out his phone and said, "Selfie." I was very confused. Then he said, "What? Is there a problem?" I said, "No." Then he said, "Do you guys not take selfies anymore back in Texas?" "No, we still take selfies," I said. "Okay, let's take a selfie," he said. And after the selfie, or selfies, we went inside. And then the first step I took, I fell face first. My uncle left me there until my last day alive, and on the day he pulled a saw and cut off my head and hung it on his wall. There my head was, a pink unicorn head, sitting on a wall.
This concludes our program. I want to thank all of you at home for listening, and I want to extend a special thank you to all those who submitted their stories. I'm sure your tales will haunt listeners for many years to come. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have to sneak out of here before the library staff catches me. Happy Halloween.